Imhotep. Horus here. Today we're going to explore aesthetics, their cultural significance, and some common criticisms. As a divine sky god, much of my time is spent observing you mortals and your curious rituals. So much energy and conflict is centered around competing ideologies, and wherever you find ideologies, you will find aesthetics. Be it religion, economic theory, or sociology, every political movement is accompanied by evocative aesthetics. These can be visual cues, dialectical notes, and slang and symbology. The affectations of different political and social movements will always have corresponding cultural expressions. And just as the members of socio-political movements will often be at odds with other movements, cultural aesthetics are often held under scrutiny by similar or rival cultures. The actions of fanatic mortals make for such intriguing study. So let's look at some forms of cultural aesthetics that have grown up around socio-political movements and their significance in the enlightened world. There is a term that has become common parlance, and I find it rather intriguing. Larp, an acronym for live-action roleplay. Larp's original meaning literally referred to fantasy tabletop game fanatics donning costume and assuming characters, as well as, roles, to physically act out stories and scenarios in real time. It is a largely social activity and at its core innocent enough. LARP is a fairly neutral term that didn't evolve to have much connotation beyond the implied virginal status of its practitioners. But as is customary with language, terminology evolves. Right now we see the term being wielded as a pejorative against persons or groups that we deem to be presenting exaggerated aesthetics tied to a culture or ideology. Anglo men with beards, tactical vests, and openly displayed firearms are often said to be LARPing, in this case playing soldier. Hardcore fanatics of regimes in post-Tsarist Russia are often affecting ushankas, hammers, and sickles, and excessive amounts of red in their efforts to visually represent their political ideology. These individuals are often also said to be LARPing. I've seen the term applied to those who enjoy the trappings of Kemet, but I obviously wouldn't know anything about that. One troubling thing that I see from a lot of people who weaponize this term against others is an implied insincerity, be it right-wing demonstrators strapped with weaponry, anime profile avatars wearing Soviet military garb, or fascists wearing khakis and performing Roman salutes. We are led to assume that the person branded with this title are merely performing. They are but actors, immersing themselves in the trappings loosely associated with their ideology merely because they like the way it appears. However, I am suggesting that maybe every person who LARPs isn't necessarily insincere in their beliefs, and in fact their beliefs may very well align with the appearance. I also believe that every cultural aesthetic isn't necessarily what we would consider LARPing in this context. Now, I stated earlier that LARP is a neutral term that has gained new connotations, but it should be known that we can't always divorce the performative roleplay aspect from the ideological. Many powerful entities and political movements throughout history were, at least in part, inspired by an aesthetic fantasy. Look no further than the visual political propaganda during the First and Second World War. Every nation involved had their vision of the role and aesthetic of their ideal patriot. Some groups wanted to portray their citizenry as stoic, capable laborers grinding away at the mills and granaries to fuel the war effort. Others may have focused on hygiene, grooming, or economic mobility. But it goes even deeper than that. It is common knowledge that Hitler was invested in an ahistorical view of the genetic makeup of early humans. He carried a distorted view of the importance of phenotypical traits common among people of a certain geographic region, and the world that he envisioned was one where everyone played the same role, specifically the role of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, physically superior, intellectually powerful superhuman or Übermensch. He called them Aryans, and despite the fact that the original usage of the term Aryan referred to people of Indo-Iranian and South Asian descent, his scholars believe that Aryans were some master race of Nordic globe-trotting conquerors who established every major civilization before being lost to race mixing. You will find a pattern of historical illiteracy and fantastical nonsense amongst these groups, something they have in common with RPG LARPers, I suppose, with a modicum of murderous intent sprinkled in. Sadly, you see the history of fantasy and roleplay arise in origins of many white supremacist groups in the United States. An increasing number of mothers would find themselves widows after their working-class husbands died untimely deaths. This left them with a family to raise, no education, and little to no job prospects for women at the time. A group of Catholic men banded together to form a nonprofit support network to provide food, housing, and living costs to these families. This organization wanted a notable Catholic male figure to be the face of their movement, so they called themselves the Knights of Columbus, referencing the medieval warriors of honor and heroism of European lore, and Columbus, some unremarkable Genoese colonizer. To this day, they have ceremonies where they wear anachronistic outfits and medieval weaponry. The Freemasons are a social club dating back to the 1400s, named after masonry guilds that regulated the certification and trade of masons or people who craft stone structures. Even now, this organization prides itself on secrecy amongst its members and allows a whole host of conspiracy theories to arise about its inner workings. They use terminology like journeyman and artisan to rank their members and center all of their operations around a grand lodge, despite the fact that the majority of their members are most certainly not stonecutters. They definitely seem to enjoy LARPing as if they are some ancient order of master craftsmen, down to their love of symbology and garish costumes. It should be noted that some people attempt to link them to the laborers of Kemet, and let me be the one to say, officially, do not associate me with these clowns. Going back to angry white Caucasians, the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan, are an order of white supremacists that had 3 distinct iterations since the end of the Civil War. The name was most likely derived from the Greek term kuklos, which means circle. They probably took this from the Kuklos Adelphon, a collegiate Greek society, which is a laughable form of LARP that I won't be getting into. Essentially, a group of LARPers and fantasy lovers who were mad that black people were now citizens took it upon themselves to perform voter intimidation, workplace discrimination, and good old-fashioned murder. But when you look at the organizational hierarchy, which at one point went by the name Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, you see titles like Wizard, Grand Dragon. They often envision themselves as ghosts of the Confederacy or mystical riders as they rode through the night, wearing white robes and hoods to commit acts of terrorism against minorities. Once again, you see a group infusing mythology and folklore into their aesthetic and inspiring their hateful ideology. There are others as well. Black Israelites see themselves as true sons and daughters of Israel. Their ceremonies are often performed with ceremonial apparel and props. Theirs is an extremist interpretation of the Torah. The Nation of Islam have assumed a radical take on the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. They can be seen wearing odd attire and practicing dated cultural traditions. Interestingly enough, there is a common greeting that has been repurposed to refer to followers of mine or those who engage in the aesthetics of Kemet. Oddly enough, this term is often used to apply to the extremist groups I mentioned earlier. This is particularly confusing to me, as I seriously doubt they would accept that title themselves. I don't see how the self-proclaimed children of Israel would adopt a title derived from Kemet. These two groups famously share a very conflicted history. I also don't understand why someone espousing the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad would be given that label either, as they were often at odds with the culture of my followers. Both of these groups speak 2 completely different languages, separate from my own entirely. Also, one cannot ignore that powerful women were often venerated in Kemet, filling roles as warriors, queens, heads of household, and deities. Not to mention that Kemet had highly progressive views for the time toward the concepts of gender and sexuality. All of this is to say that one shouldn't assign a label used by lovers of Kemetic aesthetics to modern-day children of Israel or followers of the Prophet, or those who base their ideology in the hatred or exclusion of others. And dare I say, many of these groups don't appreciate the label either, and if one is uncertain as to what to call a certain group, perhaps ask first. But staying silent is also an option. Do you get it? Ultimately, we have taken what was once an innocent, politically neutral acronym like LARP and given it new meaning. But isn't it a bit reductive the way we use that term? In the new life that LARP has taken on, we do away with all nuance and immediately invoke the most negative connotations, turning something that denotes cultural effects and hobbies into a derogatory term. We seek to imply insincerity on the part of the target when we say that they are LARPing, but we really cannot logically group all forms of roleplay together. When we go to the forum, we are all playing some type of role. Are we not? Someone placing the imported artwork from the Far East on their wall or children's figurines in the backdrop while they address an audience is playing a role. That being the role of someone who engages in similar consumption to their target fan base. Individuals of a plundered culture who seek to express the aesthetics of an ancient society that embodied elegance, posterity, intelligence, and success that may have been someone adjacent to their ancestors, well, they are playing a role too. And it goes both ways. Angry Western chauvinists obsessed with cereal grains who take to the streets to engage in brawls with progressive demonstrators are the ones who don military-style accessories and weaponry to intimidate the masses. They are playing a role too, much like a group of despondent, defeated, angry white men who met up in secret chambers to engage in weird rituals and call each other fantasy-inspired names like dragon and wizard before donning white robes to ride off and commit acts of racially inspired terrorism. They're all playing a role. So if someone decides to wear the decals of a bygone regime to match their ideology, maybe they are LARPing. But I think that we need to remember that not everyone who LARPs is insincere, and not everyone who expresses cultural aesthetics are LARPing. We are very capable of understanding this level of nuance. We can see when someone is misusing terms like, say, communist or anarchist or socialist, and I think it would not be too much energy to apply that same level of nuance and subtlety and understanding to a subject like LARP. At the end of the day, all that really matters is what role do you play?